Greetings, you curious here and curious or Herle Burly-ites. A pod today that starts with a bit of time travel. We're going back to the Ontario of 1985, but not for the sake of a melancholy stroll down memory lane. I want to explore how a new, at the time, Liberal government came to power and immediately enacted a series of major reforms and initiatives that still reverberate in the province today. And that's the lens I want to use to focus this conversation. The lessons in this story of innovation and political will we can use to meet the challenges of today. With me is the principal of the remarkable transformation and two of his principal secretaries, the Honourable David Peterson, 20th Premier of Ontario, and Borg and Hershell Ezrin. I'm going to be very brief with these bios because we're going to tell the story in some depth over the next hour or so. 40 years ago this month, David Peterson became the first Liberal to lead the province since Harry Nixon, ending a 42-year PC dynasty. He served as Premier from 1985 to 1990. Today, he's Chairman Emeritus of the law firm of Cassels Brock Blackwell LLP and Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Toronto. Borg was Principal Secretary to Premier Peterson and is a past president of the Ontario Liberal Party. His long career took him from the back rooms of Queen's Park to the boardrooms of corporate Canada. Hershell Ezrin also served as Principal Secretary and Deputy Minister to Premier Peterson. He had a long and distinguished career in public service at both the federal and provincial levels and is now a senior fellow at Global Public Affairs. David, Vince, Hershell, we've been through some wars together, so this isn't going to be the strongest accountability interview, but let's have some fun together over the next hour or so. Thanks for joining me.
It's always fun being with you, no matter what happens.
Okay, so let's start at the top. As I remember the spring of 1985, it was a pretty bleak time to be a Liberal. The federal party had been demolished in a federal election the fall before, and had lost so badly that there was speculation that maybe the Liberal Party would be overtaken by the NDP in the country. And you were facing, there were no provincial governments in the country. I think until Frank McKenna might have been the first one, but you would have been the second one, is my guess.
I think it was Bourassa and then Frank.
But Bourassa doesn't really count, right?
Well, he counts to me because he was a big part of our story.
I understand that. But in terms of Liberal politics, that's a little different thing altogether. But yeah, so there was, but then people think you have no chance of winning because no Liberals won in 42 years. And Davis had seemed to be a pretty popular premier. So along comes the 85 election. David, let's start with you. Why did you win? What was going on in Ontario? I mean, you can tell me you ran an exceptionally clever campaign, and I presume that's part of it. But I also assume there was something going on.
These two guys were part of the cleverness that put it all together and read the problems. But you're quite right, David. In 1985, there was not one Liberal government in the country. And the thought was they're going to be expunged like the soft, mushy middle, like Britain or whatever. And don't forget, just to add to the trauma here, in the 84 election, we had four of our key cabinet opposition members, and we didn't have that many, left and ran federally. Most of them lost.
For the greener pastures.
For the greener pastures of John Turner.
Yeah.
And then Mulroney came in, and people would say, somebody quoted me as saying, Peterson, you had a goofy grin on your face the day Mulroney won. And why was that? And the answer was, I knew, and I shared it with Hershell and Vince Ergo, says, we can win. And why can we win? Because the nation is in turmoil. Because change is in the air. Because you're setting up a conservative government in Ottawa. People, historically, there's been the old Underhill curve, and Ontario, we have a chance if we do things right. So the first point is politically, it was ready for something new. And don't forget, we were almost starting with a tabula rasa. We were starting new, and there was a little joke at the time, David. People would say, they take a survey. Herschel's a big survey guy, and he'd take a survey, and nobody knew who I was. But then they'd ask them what I thought, and the ones that knew me didn't like me. So it was a real dilemma whether you get better known and more disliked. But we'll get into the substance of this. We put together a campaign that I think really reflected an awful lot of pent-up demand. The Tories were not bad government, but they were like an old shoe. And Bill Davis was a fine man and a fine premier, but he never did anything in halves he could do by quarters. And we came in aggressively with a lot of campaign, and a campaign was extremely well organized by these guys. And the minute it was called, we were on the road and we were going hard for 36 days. We can get into the substance of that, of what we talked about. But I think we reflected, I don't think the Tories understood inherently feminism. I don't think they understood the aspirations of the ethnocultural communities. I don't think they understood the environment. It was just a reaction to it. We took leads in all of these things, and aggressive leads. And we were bold on things like extra billing, the environment. And so I think it all came together, and we stitched together a coalition. And of course, Frank Miller had stepped back a step from Davis. Some people say, well, Davis, if he'd hung around, could have beat you guys, and we can speculate about that. But I believe that Bill Davis, shrewd guy that he was, understood that he, as everybody else, is subject to the vicissitudes of change and didn't want to risk it.
You know, Herschel and Vince, it wasn't an aberrant election campaign. I know we will get into the substance of the government, but as a political guy, I'm so interested in the politics around this because I think they're huge. Because it wasn't an aberrant election campaign. The two campaigns, 85 and 87, changed everything in Ontario forever. So, well, for up till now, which are, first of all, that there isn't just one governing party, that the Liberals have as reasonable a prospect of winning election in Ontario as the PCs do, which was never the case before 1985. Point number one. Point number two is the two parties are completely different. The Liberal Party became the urban progressive party, and it had been the rural conservative party. And the PCs had been the more urban progressive party, and now their base is rural and small c conservative. You people ran them out of Toronto, and they've never returned. So, what was going on there, Herschel?
Well, I think there are a few things, just to go back to something that David said. There was a huge change in the immigration patterns, for example, in Ontario. You know, between the end of the 1950s, 1960s, and going forward, Italians, Portuguese, Greeks were coming in increasing numbers especially into Ontario. You had people from the Soviet Union who were coming, who were being expelled from there and started to come. You had people even from South Africa who were fleeing the they were liberals who were fleeing the regime, the apartheid regime. All of this meant that you had people who were looking for a different kind of government than the old UK, if I can put it this way, the UK-based kind of population that existed. And when you add to that the social upheaval that was coming, and it came because people who had come from other places were facing, they were working hard, and they two income families, both parents had to work. Things like Sunday shopping may not have sounded all that sexy to a lot of people, but the reality was it was a necessity for people who were otherwise not being able to look after their families in a proper way. And then we also did some things in that campaign that sort of signaled that we were different. I know it's not popular, but beer and wine in the corner store started there. We started talking about stuff that said we're a contemporary government. And then once we got in, we actually took a lot of steps that were going to make a difference. But to go back to the last point that I would make, to go back, David Peterson also changed. He was elected by the Clear Grit group and others that you had mentioned, but he took it upon himself to go out and meet with, in a 3-year period between 1982 when he was elected leader and 1985, to meet with different groups without the media present. And he started to get a real appreciation of what their needs were and what their problems and what their challenges were, so that when the 1985 election came, we were ready to be able to talk about the issues in a way that the Clear Grits couldn't have.
Okay. Vince, what's your take on how 85 happened?
I'd echo everything that David and Hershell said, but the undercurrents of the demographic changes were so fundamental. And as Hershell referenced, we went out and reached out to stakeholders in all of those ethnocultural communities. There wasn't an evening where David wouldn't go to 6 different Toronto caravan events. But the overarching important point here is that campaigns matter. But campaigns matter only if you're ready for them. And we spent those 3 years getting ready in terms of a progressive platform that contrasted with the Miller, Ontario, with a tour that was ready to go off the mark. So we had done a lot of groundwork with stakeholders, ethnocultural communities, that laid the foundation for us to take advantage of the second that the election was called.
You know, Vince, you mentioned that, but something that you were very much involved in was the recruiting of new candidates. We had a group of new candidates now running that met and accepted and were excited by David's leadership. And you were able to bring a lot of new people in that we never had as quality candidates before.
You know, just to go back in terms of perspective, Ontario, in 1975, my first provincial election that I was involved in, got involved with a lawyer by the name of Fred Can. And he ran against Larry Grossman, who subsequently became the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. At the time, this was so unusual to have a Chinese Canadian candidate. Fast forward into 85, we had Bob Wong take that very seat and ended up being the first Canadian Chinese Minister of Energy. We had Alvin Curley sweep Scarborough North as a Jamaican-born leader of that community. We had a range of people across the province, but particularly in Metro Toronto. And to underline how we used to be a southwestern rural run, we had candidates across metropolitan Toronto that we had never, ever had before.
Right.
Just to illustrate your point, you know, when we got in, you're quite right, David. It was a rural run. And to his credit, Stuart Smith, my predecessor, had started the process of dragging the party into the modern age / the cities. And issues like tough issues, rights for minorities, LGBTQ rights, and things like that. It was really tough on a lot of the farmers that had been the core of the Liberal Party. So, but when we went, and there was one member of Parliament then, it was Margaret Campbell. You remember, we had one Liberal in all of Toronto, and she was considered an aberration. And we put together, and Vince and Hershell were very important in this, a group of candidates. I will argue, and I'm biased, that was the finest cabinet ever assembled in the history of it. I'm talking about people of unbelievable quality, like Ian Scott and John Sweeney and Bob Nixon and Sean Conway, Jimmy Bradley, best minister in the environment ever. Now, I'm a little biased about this, but by God, it was a high-functioning team that by and large got along extremely well.
So, a lot of copper boom talk here in this space. How our presenting sponsor TELUS is using the sale proceeds from their legacy copper telephone lines, a considerable sum given the boom, as well as the redevelopment of their decommissioned copper real estate sites to make some social good. In telling that story the last couple of weeks, I've been doing a bit of a drive-by of another key piece. So it's time to talk more about copper's replacement, the far more durable and lightning-quick TELUS Pure Fiber network. More specifically, the environmental wins inside the wires. Starting with this, for TELUS, innovating isn't solely about developing new technology. It's also about creating sustainable solutions that benefit people and the planet. Pure fiber networks are 85% more energy efficient than copper. To date, as part of the copper retirement program, they've reduced 9,300 tons of GHG emissions, equivalent to removing about 2,000 cars from the road. Each ton of recycled copper saves 3 tons of GHG emissions when compared to traditional mining. And the TELUS optic TV signal running on pure fiber is powered by 100% renewable energy. TELUS has now successfully migrated 99% of their eligible internet customers to pure fiber. Their goal is to create Canada's most sustainable internet technology. Like all good and progressive things, that takes continuous investment. So, over the next few weeks, I'm going to talk about how TELUS is putting their money where their values are, their capital expenditures. But for now, I'll just leave this key stat here. TELUS will invest more than $70 billion over the next 5 years to expand and enhance their network infrastructure and operations across Canada. I take that to mean there's a lot more TELUS innovation and more sustainability to come. So let's move into the beginnings of the government, the deal with the NDP. The governing accord, if you will, had a list of items on it that you both agreed would be the priorities of the government. Where'd that list come from? You or them?
Well,
were they demands of the NDP or were they areas of common ground?
Hershell was sort of chief, was of the negotiating team, Ian and Hershell and Bob Nixon. But let me tell you from my perspective, everybody has different perspectives. There was nothing on that list that we did not campaign. Had we not had an accord, I would have done it anyway. But the accord, and I'll tell you why I think the accord came along, and then you can get the views of Hershell and Vince. But what happened was the NDP were shell-shocked. Don't forget, they had half the number of seats of us. We had 48, the Tories had 52. The one thing they did not want was an election. We had so much momentum after that campaign. I was quite prepared to go right back to the people, should that be necessary. Because there was a sense, David, then, and these things are all transitory, that had we been going for another week, we would have had a majority. We were just on an uplift, and you've seen these things go. And when they go, they go.
Both ways, yeah.
Both ways. Yeah. I've been both sides of this one, so I have experience. And so when they said, well, let's do it, it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. It was the original idea. I'm not sure it was them not wanting to risk an election. And I was totally happy with that. But they came to us with a much longer list of the stuff that was in the accord. And I said, no way. They also came and said, well, let's have a coalition government. And I said, no way. We're not, and we didn't even have a picture together, you'll recall. We said, this is our government. You can support it. If you don't like us, throw us out. But you don't want to impede that ability to act, particularly when we were so aggressive about it.
You know, there are a few very specific things about the accord. First of all, it was only things that were in both parties' election platforms. And a lot of the things that were listed were just literally bullet points, do better at something, fix something. It wasn't anything more detailed than that. And it was left to us to try to figure out how you actually went about dealing with acid rain and spills and
Separate school funding.
inventing the blue box, for example, which was one of our solutions, which still exists to this day. The other thing was that we argued that, okay, you've got 60, there was a lot of concern about whether any kind of accord could work. It was, first of all, something that was done in a framework of fiscal responsibility. We insisted on those words when we put that in. It wasn't something you couldn't do everything at once. It was going to be what we could do. The fact that David Peterson and Bob Nixon subsequently balanced the budget was just another benefit of this whole thing, because they husbanded how the money was being spent. But the most important thing from my perspective about that accord was that it allowed the NDP to vote against a number of initiatives that we wanted, which they didn't want, without bringing the government down. And that was a very important feature. Only on issues that were spelt out as confidence could their vote be guaranteed for the governments. So we had the opportunity, frankly, to have it both ways as a result of this deal.
The flip side of that, David, was that Ray was hamstrung for the ensuing 2 years before the 87 election, because we adopted then what is now known as flood the zone. We started with Bill 1, which was the Freedom of Information Act, signaling a new open government. And we just one reform initiative after another, flooding the zone. Ray was sitting there saying, I can't disagree with all of this stuff because it was all in the accord.
No.
And
right.
Just to add to that, can I tell you, it was the easiest time I had as first minister in my life. I'd go into the House, we'd bring something controversial in, and then I'd sit there and watch the NDP fight with the Tories. And they weren't fighting with us. And I'm telling you, I highly recommend this mechanism. It was so relaxing. I could go in there and have a snooze because it wasn't
from that thing, Premier, up to the supply and confidence agreement with Trudeau, the NDP can apparently be counted on to act against their self-interest in all circumstances.
But not always.
People like you.
Not always. I mean, for example, the accord process was used in BC very effectively by the NDP to get a provincial government together with the Greens. It was used in the North.
I don't know that the Greens would think it was effective.
Well, but that's always fair enough. It was used in the Northwest Territories. And of course, it was tried unsuccessfully by Dion federally.
Right.
But that's because he tried to bring the bloc in, but that's a different story.
So do you people view 85 to 90 as one coherent run of government, or do you view it as two chunks, 85 to 87, 87 to 90?
Well, if I go ahead, David.
Go ahead. You go ahead, Hershell.
All right. Well, for me, it was one coherent approach because we had a very ambitious agenda. We probably didn't realize at the time just how ambitious it was because we just kept going, as Vince said, flooding the zone. But there were things we couldn't get done. You look at social assistance reviews and then other things. They had to wait for the substance of that until after the first election, after 87. So you had a lot of things that came about through the whole period or only finally got implemented towards the end of that period. So from my perspective, it was all of one in terms of our agenda and our platform.
Right. So, Premier, you don't think of it as the NDP Accord government and then the Liberal majority government?
No.
Okay.
There was operationally it was different, but in substance it wasn't. We had a lot of the same ministers. Don't forget, these ministers had very, very, very full plates. You take a guy like Conway, bringing in separate school funding. I mean, it was as complicated legally and politically a piece of legislation as in the history of the country. And to manage our way through this
Why'd
And
you do
then
it?
what?
Why'd you do it?
We did it. You know that, I mean, you know the history of Ontario politics, and the Liberal
I
Party
do.
traditionally represented the Catholics,
Yeah.
and the Episcopalians were all Tories, right? And a little background. I am told on very good authority in 1972, Bill Davis agreed with Bob Nixon, then the leader, and Archbishop Pocock to full funding. Then Davis turned, this was before I was involved in politics, and had a rally, turned on the Catholic Church and said, we're not doing it. And he ran his campaign on not one dime more. This not one dime more for separate schools, even though it had been enhanced by John Robarts to cover up to grade 10. I think that Bill Davis carried this guilt, and I think Archbishop or the Cardinal Carter got to him and persuaded him to change his mind. He announced this plan, which had been always under the water. No, it wasn't a highly visible issue. Davis came out of the blue, announced full funding, and I didn't even know until I stood up in the House that day. We had no advance notice. They said, yes, we support this, always have, even though that's always been our position. And then the Tory party split over this. You recall that Miller was very upset about all this. And whether we are the beneficiaries of that or not, I don't know. But what we were is intellectually, philosophically, and policy-wise resolute and didn't fool around. We were there and we took our hits.
All right,
the
Vince,
opposite of
Vince,
that
you're
is-
a Catholic like I am, okay? You are a Catholic like I am. So you're going to want to argue through the course of this interview that this government was ahead of its time on a whole bunch of issues. And I think you've got a great argument about that. But I would argue that on this issue, you were behind the times, because it might have made sense to have separate schools in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s. But by the 80s, the level of religious affinity among Christians was already on the decline. And like nobody would do it today. Right?
But if you were stitching together a country, David Herle, you might. And if that was the price of Confederation, which it was, if you've got to have read your Confederation debates, you've got to know about what went on in this country. This country would not have been put together without a lot of these compromises between English and Catholic and Upper and Lower Canada with different legal systems. And don't underestimate the history of why we're here and today. I'm not saying I'd start today doing this, but we had an obligation to complete for the sake of national unity.
But you know, if you go and look at other issues that sort of have some of that flavor, the Peterson government really took action on Francophone rights in the province. And if you looked at the wide swaths, certainly of the people who supported the Conservative Party, this was not something that they were very enthusiastic about. But you look at it in a nation-building context, it was very important for the way that we were able to then talk to the province of Quebec and say, you know, we're doing stuff in the province of Ontario that's not necessarily politically all that thrilling for some of the groups, but it's about nation building, and we're building this country together. And it helped to bring Quebec on side to look at some of the bigger, broader issues which they were dealing with.
So you had at the same time as the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario were resisting all of these changes, including Francophone rights at the time. You had the Federal Party with a new leader in Brian Mulroney taking a leadership stand in Manitoba protecting minority language rights.
Yep.
One of Mulroney's finest moments.
The question of how to most effectively reply to the Trump administration's yo-yoing, punishing tariffs is plainly the single most important public policy issue in Canada right now. The operative phrase there, by the way, is most effectively. Canada's first reflex was to impose dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs, but Prime Minister Carney abandoned that idea early, and for good reason. The idea is to inflict maximum impact in the United States, but simultaneously minimize the impact on Canadians. Be smart about it, in other words. Well, our sponsor, CN, would respectfully suggest another response that falls into the most effective Be Smart category, making Canada more attractive to investment. The fact is, Canada's economic momentum has been feeble for several years, particularly compared to the US. Between early 2015 and the middle of last year, Canada's GDP per capita grew 1.4%. In some of those years, it actually shrank. Meanwhile, the United States enjoyed 18.2% growth over the same period. Canada is less productive. Simple as that. And the big reason, if not the biggest reason, is taxation. The US has pro-growth tax policy. It allows businesses to write off the cost of capital investments more quickly. Actually, the massive new spending bill just passed by the House of Representatives will allow early and complete depreciation of capital investments, meaning if a business spends a lot of money on a thing to improve its performance, it can claim the entire cost as a tax deduction immediately rather than over a period of years. That will draw more investment to American business at Canada's expense. CN argues that Canada must adopt similar tax reforms. Not doing so shackles our businesses. Retaliatory tariffs, however justified, impoverish us all. Accompanying them with tax reform and other measures that will make Canada more competitive is just being smart about it. Okay, let's get to your finest moments, Premier. So let's take this 5-year run of government. And what's your elevator speech of the things you're proud of about that period of time?
Well, it's not. Let me back up and say something else. Then I'll come to your question. The second part of the regime was dominated by two big issues that
Which
were
I'm going to get to specifically.
but Meech and trade. I'll
Yep.
come to that. Okay.
Yeah, oh yeah, no.
Yeah. I think what we did, and I can't measure this, David. I think we made more, like millions of people, feel good and participate in their province and in their country. I think we blew the dust out of the place, and that's, is that one legislative achievement? There's hundreds of legislative achievements. Is that more important than ending extra billing? More important than separate school? More important than Meech Lake? Our ill-fated attempt to keep this country whole over Meech Lake? Was it different than our economic strategy, which is different than Mulroney's? And I'll tell you, you read what we said today, it was pretty relevant to all the arguments in the country. We were way ahead of our time. So, but is that a victory? No.
Right.
But for historians and people that care about it is very, very relevant. So again, David, we were very minority individual rights based, and we said, look, we want to help you. We want you to take ownership. And we did this with women in government and with ethnocultural groups and new people. I think we substantially changed the sociological base of this problem.
Interesting.
It used to be a bunch of cigar-smoking men sitting in the back rooms of the Albany Club, running the joint, or at the Park Plaza every Tuesday morning, and they'd sit there.
And the outcome, and one of the reasons why the legacy resonates today, is political plurality was introduced to a province that had been run by one party for 42 years. And at the time, the only other political party in the world was Albania that had lasted as long.
Mm. Right. So what's your modernization speech? What are the things that the government did to pick up on where Vince just went in terms of conservatives for 42 years? Perhaps the province was ready for some big changes. What are the big changes you're most proud of?
You can start with the way government ran. Openness, freedom of information, and privacy legislation that was introduced in Ontario. You could, I'm not sure these days if I would be as proud about bringing television to the legislature or not, but nonetheless, we did that sort of thing. You had all kinds of opportunities for parliamentary committees to investigate stuff, whether it's hydro or any number of other things. All of this was happening and giving people a voice in terms of the way that legislation was being developed and all the rest. Then you actually had some remarkable things. David's mentioned a few of them. We had more women in cabinet ministers in his 5 years than we had in the last 100 before that. Actually, twice as many as in the 100 years before that. But we also had more women assistant deputy ministers and deputy ministers. All of that was started. Equal pay for work of equal value. So there were all of those kinds of things that were being developed. On the environmental front, I'm very proud of the fact that we did so many initiatives to try to deal with acid rain, to try to deal with recycling and issues like that. So we can go through lists, but they were all there. But as you want to ask the question about the economy, but I just want to emphasize that there were three things that were highlights for me about the economy. The first is the building of premiers' councils that were going to take initiatives to try to build a different, innovative technological economy for Ontario. The second was that we did something, we expanded our view to Europe and to Asia, setting up offices in those places and trying to establish it, partly because we saw the free trade debate. I'm sorry for getting ahead of you on this, but the free trade debate that was happening with Mulroney as buying us time to do other things, because nobody was ever able to solve the dispute resolution mechanism problem with the Americans. All the same problems on softwood lumber and on cars and everything else, they were all happening then. They're still happening now. Agriculture, dairy. So we said, we've got to try to find a way to find new markets for Canada and for Ontario as an important province. And then we also did something else, and that was balance the budget. And so we did it in a fiscally responsible way.
All right.
David?
All right. Yes.
David, the other flip side of Ontario being run from the Albany Club was that, and this was good policy and good politics, we decentralized all kinds of government functions and ministries. Agriculture went to Guelph. Sault Ste. Marie had an agency. So we spread around the benefits, the economic benefits, and there was resistance in the bureaucracy because they were so used to being in Toronto and that was it. But all regions of the province benefited from those kind of policies.
Do they really,
David,
though? Do they really? Can you really get the best person to run the lottery company to live in Sault Ste. Marie?
Well,
sure you can.
Really?
And and the OPP thought of it earlier. We spread these jobs all around the place. People travel. Good Lord, the best people. Here's the best people in the world sitting here, and we're not even in the same room. Yes, the answer is. But another thing we did.
I don't think it is run out of Sault Ste. Marie. I think people work in Sault Ste. Marie, but I don't think that's where the thing is run.
Well, the current chairman was up there the other day because I had drinks with him the other night. Right. But one of the key guys who was involved with that loved the idea of going to Sault Ste. Marie because he rode his motorcycle all the way up there.
These guys would go fishing on the weekends.
But I would never fight with you. I only fight with Vince. But I am going to fight with all of you about your fiscal record.
David, let me, you can fight with anybody you want. Yeah. But don't forget, there was a patronage issue here, too. Do you know that, you won't remember this, but every single job in the liquor store was order in council. Had to be. It was, and I remember one day.
I don't know that. That's funny.
But they would have to. If you want a job in a liquor store in the old days, you go down and see the Tory member of Parliament or the defeated candidate, and he'd get your job. Somebody brought a list to me one day, said, "Sign this." I said, "What's this?" He said, "Jobs." I said, "I'm not signing this. Go to Manpower. If you want a job, go to Manpower like other people, and and get a job. I mean, and it was appointment of judges. It was QCs. There's all these things. There was a patronage infested system. We blew the lid off all of that and tried to bring competence and objectivity to all of this stuff.
Cool. I don't mean to fight with you. I have questions about your fiscal record. Maybe it would be great if we had the finance minister here to talk with us about it too. But it's funny because you've all mentioned the balanced budget and you've all mentioned fiscal responsibility. And when I was asking ChatGPT what I should talk to you about, it was telling me that you were a fiscally responsible government that delivered the first balanced budget in quite some time in Ontario. But in the vagaries of my mind, I remember something different. I remember, and I looked it up, and no government has increased spending more from the previous government than your government did in Ontario history. In terms of the leap in per capita spending that went on, it's the biggest jump in Ontario history from the Davis government to your government. And I recall that the recession that was caused by the Bank of Canada in the early 1990s, at the time, some people said that the inflation the Bank of Canada was fighting was being fueled by Ontario government spending. In a time of great economic growth, the government kept spending and stimulating the economy, and that forced the Bank of Canada to put the brakes on everything. So it is a historical fact that you delivered a balanced budget, but you were also, compared to your predecessors, a free spending government. Is that not correct? And I don't say that. I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying you should take that as a criticism. I'm not saying you should take this as a criticism. It's just an observation.
We spent more. There's no question, and there's we talked about the pent up demand. For separate schools. Bill Davis brought in separate schools. Said it was going to cost $300 million. It cost billions. I mean, they underestimated everything. We paid. By the way, we cleaned up the books. You know, when they bought Suncor, for example, it wasn't even on the books. They did all this stuff off book. We cleaned up an awful lot of the accounting that had gone sideways. Nobody cares about this because you don't know about it. But we cleaned up the books, had an absolutely clean set of books, and we cut taxes on OHIP premiums and things like that. We raised some taxes, rebalanced the tax system, and we always had the view, it was always my view, David, if you want something, you got to pay for it. And we wanted something, people wanted stuff, we paid for it, and we didn't leave a mess for our kids to clean up. So I think that is totally fiscally responsible.
We had years and years of underfunding of the health and educational sectors.
That's the critical fact. That is absolutely the critical fact. If you underfund enough stuff for long enough, anybody who comes after you and starts to fund it at some proper level is going to look like they've spent more than anybody else.
Right.
And if you look at the numbers in Ontario right now, you see that when you compare money that's being spent in education or in some other areas against the way money's being spent in other provinces, we are underspending in Ontario. So you have to put those things in context. There has to be a context to that.
Social services, there was a backlash against your reforms in that area under the Harris government, was there not?
Well, there's a backlash in Harris. Everything we did, including building roads, he sold them.
Right.
Build roads, he sell them. I mean, Michael had a very different view. He grabbed it. It wasn't us. The NDP had come in. What happened is Bob Rae came in and beat us fair and square in 90.
Yeah.
At his view, and it was clear that there was sort of dark clouds on the horizon. And Bob Rae said, we are going to spend our way out of this. You think we were excessive. So they went crazy. They went crazy until after about 2 years, Bob got religion, said the bank chairman got to him and said, you can't be doing this. So you've got to take a different approach to this. But and there was so much, shall we say, bloat in the system. It created an opposite political reaction to Mike Harris and his New Deal. So these are the vicissitudes and the waves of politics, David. And
David, I would like to mention that when the social assistance review ideas came forward, there was unanimous support. among the members of the legislature to tackle problems that had not been dealt with for years and years and years. And obviously, there could be individual issues that somebody might be against, but the thrust of it was not something that was controversial at the time.
One of my favorite things that you guys did was banning extra billing in the healthcare system. What can you tell me about how that went down? There was a big fight with the doctors. They were unhappy.
The biggest doctor strike in the history of Canada. And you want to talk about sensitive moments. Every day we would meet in my office. Hershell was there. Vince was there. The minister, Murray Elston, who was resolute and deserves a lot of credit.
Yeah.
Ian Scott was there because Ian was sort of pervasive. He was such a clever guy. He invited to a lot of meetings. Martin Barkin, who was the deputy, we'd take the temperature. Anybody died today? Where are the hospitals? All that kind of stuff. Where are we? And then the question, there was an enormous amount of pressure to fold. And even in our own group. And Murray Elston was resolute and measured and quiet and competent. And he handled that. How long was that strike, Hershell? Was it 30 days or something like that?
It was every day seemed like forever. I mean,
yeah,
to be honest.
But it was tough. It's very tough because if somebody dies or an ambulance is late, it becomes a national crisis. And the doctors were screaming at me. I was afraid to go to a doctor for about 20 years after I left politics.
I lived on a street where there were a couple of doctors, and they absolutely shunned my family. They would not talk to us for months afterwards because they knew that I had some involvement with the government. But the truth was that we knew from our own research, let's put it that way, you'd be interested in this part, David Herle. We knew from our own research that everybody loved their individual doctor, but didn't like doctors as a group. And when they would have members of the doctors group who would talk about they won't be able to afford their boat anymore and they won't be able to go on the extra holiday to Greece or something, that that was resonating with the public that was listening to this debate. So, but if you attacked an individual doctor, that's where the problem would be with the public.
This was by far the toughest battle we got engaged in.
And the tricky part,
just because of the politics of it, and the Conservatives were using it to fan the flames of fear among people having access to their doctor and their family doctor. They were very smart politically in driving the antipathy toward the government in acting against the doctors.
And don't forget, the tricky part I had to be sensitive to. You have a doctor strike, you don't want to take on the doctors. I don't want to destroy the institutions we have. I don't want to denigrate doctors and or destroy the healthcare system because it's going to be over at some point. And you really worry about permanent harm in a demoralized, highly important professional group of people. So it's very tricky to stand up on a principle without alienating people that could cripple your system and be unhappy forever.
Right. Okay. Can we talk about Meech?
Yep.
What was it? What motivated you to play the leading role that you played in that? It's not obvious from your background that you would have been super interested in a constitutional measure. Your policy agenda was very, very full. As you said, you could have been very, very busy just managing the home fires in Ontario. Yet you took on, I think I would say, other than the Prime Minister, you were the leading proponent of the Meech Lake Accord in Canada, in English Canada. And why was that?
David, let me just give you a few facts you probably don't know. I was deeply, deeply interested in these issues since I was in university.
Oh, yeah.
I attended Mulrooney's great conference, and when I was at Western at Laval when during the Revolution Tranquille, and I followed this. I was at the convention when Claude Ryan was there. I was deeply engaged in Quebec
Okay,
culture.
I did not know that.
I had studied twice in Trois Pistoles. I'm not sure, but I think I was the first semi-bilingual premier. Don't forget that Bourassa was a good friend of mine. I was hypersensitive about these issues and watched them very, very, very closely. I actually chaired, when I was at law school, I chaired a group that put in a submission to the B&B Commission, the Robarts-Pépin Commission.
Okay.
So, and I organized that from the University of Toronto Law School. So I was deeply personally invested in nationally. I honestly believe that the most important job of the prime minister is to keep the country together. I honestly believe, because I'd studied it, I was a great fan of John Robarts, who was from my hometown, who I knew and I actually had great affection for. And I talked to about these issues. But I was I think that I was important in putting together the Quebec City, Toronto, Ottawa axis. Don't forget, I had known Mulrooney before politics. And we had talked about these issues before. This when we were single and young. And so there, and I was attracted to, I had gone through all the discussions about the Distinct Society, the 5 conditions. I had vetted them intellectually. I was comfortable with them. Bourassa was a friend of mine. He had actually come down and spoke at a fundraiser in London, Ontario. This is the kind of bridges we tried to build. I tried, because I thought we were very, very important to this. So when it came along, I was deeply intellectually invested in this. I believe passion to this day. It was the saddest day of my life when Meech was defeated, and I blame Clyde Welch for that. As you know, I've said that before. A lot of the people around me, my dear friends, think I probably spent too much time on this. I was too invested in it, but there was a deep, deep, deep engagement, David.
Hershell, you were his principal secretary. You had run the Canada Unity Information Office for Pierre Trudeau.
Right.
How did you not inform the premier of all the things that were wrong with the Meech Lake Accord?
Well, I was also there for the. I'm glad that you're balanced about this, David. The most
balanced
important
about
thing
nothing.
In all of this was that I was very proud of being there and being part of the group that did both the patriation of the Constitution and also the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And you knew, based on how that got done, that grand compromises, or whatever way you want to put it, have to get done as well. That you got to water some of the wine that you have, and I don't make any apologies for that. I think what your question is very fair in asking is about the political consequences of being seen to be doing this and perhaps taking your eye off of the ball in people's minds about other issues which are closer to them and have more impact on them. And to that, I accept that there is fair criticism that can be made for myself and maybe some others, that we should have been more conscious and tried in our own ways to deal with that. But I have a feeling that, sometimes an opportunity exists, and this was an opportunity. And would we have been very upset if we hadn't taken the opportunity? That to me was the choice that people made, and it didn't work out.
So, Premier, is this still an unfulfilled job? Or can we just forget about it now? Or do we still have to figure out how to do this?
David, I lecture in constitutional history, so and I care about this a lot. But let me give you a long answer, short answer. People will open the Constitution at their peril. People learn not to touch it over Meech Lake because it got so fraught. Don't forget, in 1987 at Meech Lake, everybody agreed it was seen as a triumph across this country, as a triumph. of bringing to, and I give Brian a lot of credit for this, and a lot of us piled in behind him, and it was tough on guys like Don Getty and Bill Vander Zalm. They put the country ahead of themselves. In a way, I see a bit of a parallel in the country right now with Mark Carney's leadership, and my advice would be move quickly because it falls apart pretty fast. But they wanted to do the right thing for the country, and a strange collection of people. What happened, it deteriorated from 87 to 90, and Clyde Wells lit the match. It could have gone, I threw my body on the tracks because I believe this, David. I believed passionately, and it was me, and I take complete responsibility for the failure. But if we didn't solve it then, it would never be solved, and this would haunt the nation, and it has. I'll just leave with one last story. When young interns in political circles come to Ontario, they always ask for a meeting with me and the ex-premier. It's not just me. So I meet with these kids. I had a group in from Quebec about 3 months ago, and they came in, and so very few of them were familiar with my role in Meech Lake. I mean, this is like before most people were born, so that's not the point. I asked the question, how do you feel about Quebec not being a signatory? Is that still an issue? Is that still an issue? And every single one said, I take it personally, it's still an issue in Quebec. I understand it's been washed out by the U.S. tide that's dominating politics now. But it is latent, David. It's not going to go away. Look at the PQ, look at the Bloc, look at all these issues. We had one chance. I regard it this way. It's like watching one of my kids walk across the road in front of a car, and the kid's going to be killed. And if I don't do everything I can to save that kid is going to die. I knew it. And we came within a jot of losing the country, and it's dominated Quebec politics in various degrees of intensity for the last 30 years. It was a tragedy of a lost opportunity.
You know, when you think of how Quebec has evolved sort of distant from English Canada, in my view, over the last number of decades, it makes the distinct society debate seem almost kind of quaint.
Yeah, it does. Because it is, in fact, it's just a recognition of reality. This is not a profound compliment. David, we had the best constitutional team ever assembled. 10 of the best constitutional lawyers at our team and at the Meech Lake discussions. And they were giving the best advice possible, but it got mixed up in some politics that was tragic.
You mentioned Mulroney, and of course, he's a giant of this period of time in Canadian politics. You had an interesting relationship with him because you were his strongest English ally on Meech Lake, and you were his strongest opponent, flat out period, on free trade. Tell me about your relationship with Mulroney and how it played out over that period of time.
Well, I like Brian. Everybody liked Brian. I like Brian a lot. I knew him ahead of politics. He would, good God, he was very communicative. I mean, Sunday nights, it was my night to bath my kids and put them into bed. And Christ, Mulroney would phone up and said, talk. I said, Jesus, Brian, I'm bathing my kids. What do you want to talk about? But he couldn't pass a telephone without picking it up.
Right.
But a lovely, sweet guy. Now, here's what happened. Mulroney came with us. We are a unique federation in the sense that they're the only country in the world that one piece is 40%, most decentralized country, and we're the manufacturing base. We lost, by the way, David, just to refresh your memory, 200,000 manufacturing jobs when we knew this was coming. And we thought and I invite you to reread those debates, those trade debates. And Hershell talked about this earlier, and he was right. We had a different view. We had a Premier's Council on Economic Development. We took a global view. We didn't want to put 80% of our trade eggs in one basket. We understand it's hard. You had to diversify. We had connections with all the developed Europe and Asia. We set up an office in Asia and China. We took a global view that was to be technologically driven and education driven, and not just reinforcing ourselves as hewers of wood and drawers of water. And it's a whole intellectual basis. We published a report called Competing in the New Global Economy that Robert Solow, who was a Nobel laureate from MIT, read and said the finest piece ever done by a government of how to sort of build their way into the future. Don't forget, this was almost pre-computers and pre-phones. This was a different age. And how we grab our piece of that as opposed to selling more logs. And Hershell put it perfectly. Yes, it's a way to go, but it's not the end game. And look at the problems we have today. This debate, same debate playing out today. If we'd taken a different approach, this country would be stronger than it is today.
Well, it's kind of interesting to hear you say that, though, because just thinking about the debate we're having right now, it seems that in a period of crisis where the clear focus is we have to make our economy stronger and we have to be less dependent upon the United States, the answer appears to be to draw more water and hew more logs.
There you go. And if you don't have your piece of the technological revolution, we don't have enough of it. Where we do some things well, but by God, that should have been the number one emphasis. And what happened was, and I love Brian, but in his desire to immortalize himself, he tried to sort of got 10,000 articles about how free trade saved this country. And one of the articles might start saying, maybe the free trade day took us down a blind alley where we have far too dependent on one crazy human being.
David Herle, I want to just come back to your point. There are a couple of issues that are really relevant here. One is that we governments can only do so much. The private sector also has to do something. And the private sector, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. And the private sector was much more attracted to an integrative kind of economy with the Americans than looking to go to other places. And that was true then, and it's still in parts true now, although they may have to deal with that. Secondly, you have to look at these things as being short and medium term. In the short term, we probably don't have any choice but to deal with certain issues as hewers of whatever the thing is for water.
I think we hew the wood and draw the water.
Okay,
but really what we do is pump the oil. What we really do is pump the oil.
Yeah, but in the medium term, we really have to get our act together and go in a different direction. And I think that is in essence what we're talking about now. David Peterson, I remember accompanying him to the World Economic Forum in
Davos.
Switzerland and Davos, and it was a very interesting kind of discussion there that was led by David, because we were trying to make connections in a very real and tangible way with people, and I think that we've got to do that again. But we've got to have business leadership doing this too. It's not enough for government to do it alone.
So Margaret Thatcher is elected in 1979, and Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, and Brian Mulroney is elected in 1984, and you are elected in 1985. And between the modernization of Ontario society, the expansion of the role of government in so doing, the battle against free trade with the United States, is your government the last gasp of the anti-neoliberalism agenda before neoliberalism took over Canada for 20 years?
Hershell, you answered that. You're the smart one.
No, I was going to ask David Herle what he thought, because
I think yes. This is why I'm posing it.
Yeah, but the reality is
everything about your spending, your role of government philosophy and your trade philosophy was Listen, I think neoliberalism, frankly, was a large mistake, and I think the excesses of it have brought us Donald Trump. And so I don't look back on the last 20 years with any nostalgia, particularly, but I do think that your government was an aberrant one at that time.
Or to put it a different way, we were ahead of our times.
Well, fair enough, whatever.
I mean, and if we were ahead of our time, we were swimming against a current that had all of these other factors, and because we weren't able to stay after 1990, I mean, if we had been able to stay, maybe we would have been able to do some other things.
The consensus was so strong back in those days. Like if you were anti-free trade, you were economically illiterate, right?
Right. But we entered you. I invite you to read those debates, David, because and you read our reports. Some obscure academic may do it someday, but it was prescient to the troubles we had today. Now, we didn't know an aberrant president was going to come along. We didn't know have to deal with crazy people, but we know that it was not smart to do 80% of your business with one person. And we had, when I was there, Ontario had the 11th largest GDP of any country in the world, had it been a separate country. We're big, and we have to control our own destiny. That doesn't mean we couldn't be part of a greater Canada. But I tell you, it was there was a lot of short-term thinking in there. And the route we would have picked, was long and hard, but much more successful in the long term, in the modern world. Don't forget, it was called competing in the new global economy. That word didn't even exist then, Dave.
Right.
We were ahead of our time.
Okay, can I ask you a personal political question, which is in 1989, you are without question the most popular and powerful Liberal in Canada. Why do you not run for the federal Liberal leadership?
I think it would be pretentious. I'm aware of my history. Nobody ever did. Nobody ever has turned premiership into being prime minister. People did come to me. Francis Fox led a great big delegation, came down, said a whole bunch of people came to me, but it didn't interest me, and I didn't consider myself, to be perfectly honest, a career politician. My life has mostly been serendipity. Nice things happened to me. I got a chance to implement the philosophy. It's a lot of things I believed in about progressive government, responsible government, about not cleaning up the environment, about not asking our kids to pay for our excesses. There's a lot of moral principles underneath all of this, David. But I was happy. To be perfectly honest, I thought I'd win again. Now, you can write off, say how stupid I am, but I thought I was going to win in 1990. I would have very happy. I had thought we'd have a leadership in 3 years. Somebody else would take over the party, and I'd go do something else. I'd go and start a podcast or something.
Don't be last. Everybody else has one already.
Okay. Nobody would listen to me. They're all listening to you.
Vince, what do you think? Did you think he should have run for the leadership back in 1989?
No, it had no interest. He had no interest in it.
Okay, well, it was an interesting decision. All right, so I don't want to do it, but we can't have this conversation and not do it. I have to ask you about the call. It's the election call of 1990. It goes down in Canadian history as an example of the dangers of calling an early election. There is no jurisdiction in Canada now in which somebody is considering calling an early election in which people do not cite the Peterson example. So let's just start with that. Is that correct? Did you lose because you called an early election, in your view?
I think everybody's got a take on this. I think that was a factor, but I think it was more a metaphor for arrogance. And I think it was my call. I honestly don't believe the government was unpopular. I was unpopular. And because I had made that call, then you go back and you say, well, why did we make that call? I take complete responsibility, David, but here's why I made the call. Don't forget, in 1987, Larry Grossman ran against us and ran an anti-French campaign. I remember these things. I'm very sensitive. In 1990, Meech Lake had just collapsed. It was separatism was running around 75% in Quebec then, right after the collapse of Meech Lake. It was like a dagger through the heart of Quebec. I wanted a very strong hand to deal with this. I figured if we left it, we would have a hell of a problem on our hands. So that was my big driver. Now, because it was such a sensitive issue, very hard to make that case in public. I didn't make a strong case I didn't do it well of why we had the election. But I think it was a combination of arrogance, I think a perceived arrogance, early call, and Meech Lake, which made some people mad. Don't forget, I expended a lot of political capital on that, which I didn't care about because I thought I win. We had that won, by the way, until the last moment. So I thought my conscience is completely intact on that issue. Whether I don't like losing, I hate it. And it's my responsibility. Now, everybody around me had different points of view, but by and large, people. It was your friend Marty Goldfarb would have said, "Can lose." So I'm just telling you, don't listen to pollsters or podcasters,
especially when they combine the two. Very dangerous. Actually, always listen to Marty. Don't listen to me. All right, so that's the perspective from the principal. Now, you two, Hershell and Vince, were on the campaign side. And I presume you're like me in that you think about that campaign to this day. And you didn't actually lose by much. Do you have a thought in your head about how you still could have won that election campaign?
Yeah, from the very beginning. If you're not going to win a campaign if you can't answer the first question, why did you call the election?
But surely you knew that at the time.
And we struggled with that, and David fumbled that ball, to be frank.
Hershell, any way to win that election?
Well, I think the other side of it, and I looked at the data after the campaign. The other side of it was that people wanted to upbraid the Peterson government. I don't think they wanted to defeat it. Now, I know that that's an easy statement to make, and who knows? But the reality was, look at the way the vote finally came out in 1990 with, a party that never expected to have any opportunity to be in government, all of a sudden being the government. And you saw that sort of ball started rolling downhill, or the rock rolling downhill, and then it just couldn't stop. And I think nobody was more surprised, I'm going to say, my own view, than the voters of Ontario when they saw the results that night.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Well, this has been a really enjoyable conversation. I could go on for quite some time, but Premier, I do want to say, is there anything we haven't covered that you really wanted to talk about?
No, I've actually enjoyed this. I mean, it's this stroll down. This was 40 years ago, David, and the similarities and the differences are both striking in a lot of ways. I don't spend a lot of time trying to immortalize myself over this. I consider it was the greatest privilege of my life to end up in a position to make a difference. We did. And with wonderful people. It's people say, do you miss politics? And I said, well, it's like missing the war, right? I don't miss shooting other people, but you miss the intensity of the relationships and fighting for a cause you believe in. And we did all of that. And So
There's
no,
nothing like it. You talk about the people, Premier. I want to say something to you, which is that I've continued to be, I mean, first of all, your government was a very exciting time for me, but I have continued to be involved in liberal politics over the last 40 years. And so many people through this very day who have been pillars of that enterprise come from your government. So many people, both in the Ontario level and at the federal level, who've been the Liberal Party for the last 40 years came out of your government. It was just, the talent pool was astonishing.
David, I take that as a great compliment, and there's a couple of reasons for that. As I said, that's the Liberals gravitated because we had a shot in 1985 when we won. But I honestly believe there was a pool of idealism. There was all these things that people wanted to change things, and they brought their energy and their sense of pride, and it wasn't, and they all gathered together, and it was. Idealism is the most powerful fuel in life, more important than money. And it's idealism in politics. Let us not get cynical. Let's believe we can do it. There are lessons about this, and I really believe passionately in what I'm saying. And all these wonderful young people, a lot of them got married, they met each other, they have kids. The kids are involved in politics, but there is a core of wonderful people. We're all getting together in the near future, and you're invited. Come and make a speech and tell how it used to be so fabulous.
There, I'll be there with bells on, and I'll tell the truth about John Webster. I'll be the person that tells the truth about John Webster.
Don't tell about him. Don't tell about Webster.
He'll
go to jail.
All right, you three, thank you so much. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, but I really want to thank Premier David Peterson, Hershell Ezrin, Vince Borg for your time today. Just a fascinating conversation, and by God, we've got to find some drinks and continue it because we left a lot of things on the table.
See you tonight.
Thank you very much.
See you tonight. All right, take care of yourselves.